influencing popular culture, politics, and everything in between. The local station takes you ringside as we discuss the crazy world that is professional wrestling. This is Going Ringside with the local station.
Hello there, and thank you for joining us for another episode of Going Ringside. I am your host, Scott Johnson. So glad you could be with us today. Before we move forward and talk a lot about the Billy Jack Haynes case, I want to talk about last week's episode with Holla. Teddy Long was here, the WWE former SmackDown general manager, joined us on the show. Great interview. One of my favorites we've ever had. Teddy talked to us all about his time working for the McMahons, working with guys like John Cena, The Undertaker, Ron Simmons, what it was like Stephanie McMahon versus Vince McMahon. Just a lot of very fascinating stuff in the interview with Teddy Long. I would recommend go check it out right now. It's our last week's episode, and it is a good one. And I was so happy Teddy could come on. And I do. The reason we're talking to Teddy is because he's going to be at the big event that's going to overtake Going Ringside in coming weeks. That would be River City Wrestling Con, with the biggest stars in the industry of all time coming here. We're going to be sitting down with a lot of them throughout the month of June and July, so look forward to that. We're talking about the likes of the Hardy Boys, Trish Stratus, Lita, Sting. I'm hoping to talk to as many of them as possible. So it is going to be a big event in World Golf Village in St. Johns County, Florida. If you can be there, don't miss it. Come say hi. Otherwise, we're going to have some great interviews coming out of it in weeks to come, so don't miss that. Today, I wanted to talk about something we've touched on the podcast, but never done a full episode on it, and I think it deserves it because it is topical, it is in the news right now, and it is just certainly a tragic situation. That's what happened in Portland, Oregon, involving former wrestling legend Billy Jack Haynes, who has been accused of killing his wife, with charged with second-degree murder. This happened February 8th in Portland at their home. His wife, a woman named Jeanette Beecraft, about 15 years older than he is. She's around 85 years old. I think he's 70. He is accused of murdering his wife, and we're going to talk a lot about that. Joining us on the show today will be a friend of the show who we've had on before, Joe Vithayathil, who is a news anchor out in Portland, Oregon, who has covered this case. He also is very in tune with the Portland wrestling scene, and he kind of knew very well, knew a lot about Haynes before this even happened, just as a performer many years ago. This came as a shock to everyone. A little later on, we will also talk to Belkis Plata, an attorney based here in Florida, a little about where this case will go, how it will process this second-degree murder case of Billy Jack Haynes. So before we get into the legal back and forth and the actual crime, alleged crime itself, I want to talk a little about who Billy Jack Haynes was and is. So if you grew up in the 1970s, 1980s, you may have seen Billy Jack Haynes. He happened to be the guy where I grew up. He was almost like our Hulk Hogan. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. Billy Jack Haynes was on the regional territory before Vince McMahon took over everything with the WWF. They had Portland wrestling. Down here in Florida, we had, Florida Championship Wrestling, Mid-Atlantic and Georgia Championship Wrestling above us, just to the north of us. So he had all these territories. Well, he was the top guy in Portland wrestling, alongside guys like Buddy Rose, Rip Oliver, Roddy Piper was a part of that territory. Andre the Giant and Ric Flair would go through there on occasion. So he was the top guy, big, muscular, brawny guy, had a good look. And eventually, after he had success in the regional territories, he was brought into the WWF. I almost thought he was a guy who could have been like a Hulk Hogan in WWF. He was this indestructible baby face with big muscles. He went in and faced Hercules Hernandez, was kind of the peak of his career at WrestleMania 3. And he would always dress like he was from Oregon. He would wear the Oregon Ducks college football team colors. He would have an O on his hat, I think it was. And he was a mainstream attraction in WWF at its peak. This is the same WrestleMania where Hulk Hogan fought Andre the Giant, the biggest event maybe in the history of pro wrestling. And he was a part of it. He was a big-time player in the mid to late 1980s. But after that WrestleMania 3 event, Billy Jack Haynes just kind of slowly disappeared. he just kind of went away. He never had a resurgence of his career like a lot of other guys did, where they go over to WCW and have success back and forth with WWF. You know, he did do that a little bit, but he kind of just disappeared. After that late 80s run, Portland Wrestling went out of business. He couldn't really go home again to wrestling, but he did go home to Portland, Oregon, where he's lived for decades. And he was a guy, when you mention him, wrestling fans who are longtime like me go, oh yeah, I know who Billy Jack Haynes is. He was a top guy. Remember, whatever happened to him? He was one of those guys. Whatever happened to Billy Jack Haynes? Well, for the most part, he kind of disappeared from public life. He just, for the most part, became a private citizen. Joe V will talk to us a little bit about, you know, he would pop up here and there over the years, but never really in a large-scale fashion. He never became a star again like he was. He never really cashed in on a celebrity. He just went back to Portland, and people in the local territory remembered him up there. And over the years, he kind of became a little infamous. He didn't get back into wrestling, but when, I mean, if you go on YouTube and you find all the old wrestlers, they do shoot interviews out there, and you can go watch the old school wrestlers just do these live interviews. We've had them, of course, here on Going Ringside, but there's a lot of, this has been going on for years. As long as YouTube's been around, there's been old school wrestlers telling old stories. And Billy Jack Haynes is one of the ones who started popping back up with some crazy stuff out there, weird stuff, like allegations against Vince McMahon and others. He got involved in some lawsuits and tried to sue for brain damage. This almost made it to the Supreme Court, but they didn't hear the cases just a few years ago. So he just kind of wasn't really in the industry, but you could find him on the internet talking about it. If you're really an old school diehard, you could track down some old Billy Jack Haynes videos. You can go look at them now. And you might go, the guy's a little bit out there. And a lot of people who were his compatriots who would wrestle alongside him knew him all those years. Some people were had some things to say about Billy Jack Haynes. I want Joe V to tell that story because he knows it better than I do. So anyway, for the most part, he's been off the radar all these years, other than a few times he'd get involved in some lawsuits. He would wind up on YouTube with a variety of things he would say out there. And that was Billy Jack Haynes, and that was all we knew of him. Then I get a message from some of my sources in the media out there in February of this year. They're like, do you remember Billy Jack Haynes? I was like, yeah, of course I remember Billy Jack Haynes. He was a top guy out there. And when I was growing up, he was, like the larger-than-life superhero. They say, well, the word is, we're at a police scene, that he killed his wife. That was what was initially believed. And then over the next few days, we learned out that's what he's been charged with, second-degree murder of Jeanette Beecraft, his wife, a wife who he only recently married in 2022. I believe it's his fourth wife. So they'd only recently married, obviously in their later years. He would have been in his late 60s. She would have been in her early 80s. And there are reports that she had severe, medical issues, as often comes with age, possibly some dementia issues. Did that play a role in what happened here? We don't know. We won't really know until the trial or more stuff is released. But anyway, there was a standoff with police, and it was this crazy thing on the news. And a lot of the people who covered it up in the Northwest didn't quite make the connection who Billy Jack Haynes was, because it's a lot of younger people. They weren't around when he was popular in the 1980s, but the old timers knew who this was. And eventually it came out Billy Jack Haynes has been accused of murdering his wife. And all the old school wrestling fans, they know who this is. So he was arrested. And I want to kind of talk about what's happened since his arrest. So I've been going through some of the records in Multnomah County, which is where Portland is, the county that Portland's located in. And he was arrested. They had an arraignment. They had what was called a 60-day hearing. He had 60 days to go to a trial if he chose. That's been delayed. That's been put off. They've had some hearings, but nothing's really happened. It looks like everything has been put on hold. Everything has been delayed until at least this coming November, about 7 months from now. And that's kind of pretty common with murder cases. So we're going to have Belkis Plata, a lawyer, come on a little bit to kind of describe to us how this is all going to go for Billy Jack Haynes. But first, I want to bring in Joe Vithayathil. Joe, as I said at the top of the show, is a longtime journalist, a news anchor in Portland, very close to the Portland wrestling scene. He knows some of the people who are Billy Jack Haynes' compatriots. And so he has a background knowledge of who Billy Jack Haynes is and was. He's also a journalist there and has covered this as a journalist. So I wanted to bring him on to talk a little about the Billy Jack Haynes case. So here is our interview with KPTV News anchor Joe Vithayathil to discuss the Billy Jack Haynes murder case. So joining me now to talk about Billy Jack Haynes, his current situation and his past, is Joe Vithayathil. Joe is an anchor with KPTV in Portland, Oregon, one of the stations that has been at the forefront of covering this situation with Haynes. And Joe's also a longtime fan of wrestling. He knows Portland wrestling. He grew up on Billy Jack Haynes, so knows a lot about him. So before we get into his wrestling history, Joe, you've been at the forefront. You've been covering the story. Talk to me about where we're at right now in the Billy Jack Haynes case, kind of how you guys in Portland media started to uncover this.
Yeah, it's just a obviously very, very sad story. As we're taping this, yesterday, Billy Jack Haynes was arraigned in Multnomah County Court, which is the Portland, Oregon court there. And essentially a couple weeks ago, there was an incident where police were called out to a home, and a woman, 85-year-old woman, had been shot to death, and her husband basically was refusing to, there's a standoff between her husband and the police, and they eventually took him into custody, and that person ended up being Billy Jack Haynes, who is now 70 years old. His wife is Jeanette B. Kraft. She was 85, shot to death. And our station spoke with some of the neighbors there. They said they were a great couple. They love them both. Neighbors tell us that Jeanette suffered from dementia. We haven't had that confirmed through family, but we did have neighbors who said they were close with them that have told us that. We don't know a lot about the particulars of what police say happened that night. Again, he was just arraigned yesterday. But he's been charged with second-degree murder and unlawful use of a weapon.
There's been some talk online, and I've heard from some sources, and we've kind of talked about it here on the podcast. There has been some discussion that this was possibly a case of compassionate homicide, but in more layman's term, mercy killing. Has that been confirmed at all in Portland media at all?
No, nothing's been confirmed. Nothing's been confirmed at all. That is speculation. But we have been told that, again, through neighbors, that Jeanette was suffering from dementia, but in terms of a motive, why this might have happened, that is complete speculation at this point. There's nothing that's been confirmed. Billy Jack was actually, after he was arrested, they had to take him to the hospital. He was in the hospital for medical condition for about a week and a half or 2 weeks before they could actually bring him into court and formally charge him. But he was formally charged yesterday, and it was obviously just a horrific tragedy when you have a woman shot to death in her home. But I think a lot of people, who grew up here in the 1980s where Billy Jack Haynes was a big hero and maybe haven't been following his life the last 30 years or whatever, it's been a very shocking story. And then we saw him in court yesterday, and he looks, lifetimes away from the big muscular superstar. He was in a wheelchair. I'll tell you, I had a very brief interaction with him about 10 years ago, and I was shocked seeing him in person. He was skinny. Not
the giant that we remember from 1987.
He probably weighed less than I did, and he had no teeth, and he just very kind of I don't know, just a far cry from this muscular Superman that we saw in the 1980s.
Let's take a little step back to that era. So, Joe, in kind of your other aspect of your career, you've done a lot with the Portland wrestling community, working close with Roddy Piper before he passed, another guy up in that territory, the grappler Len Denton, and you've dealt with that kind of world a lot for several years. Talk to me about Billy Jack Haynes. He has been someone who illustriously on the internet for several years now, kind of a guy who's a little bit off the reservation by many accounts.
Yeah, but first I want to put him in proper context for what he meant to the Portland wrestling
Sure.
scene, because
I said on our show he was kind of like, or he was the Northwest Territory version of Hulk Hogan.
I would say this: he was the Northwest. He was the closest thing the Northwest had to a Von Erich,
Okay.
in that he was from here. He was a local hero. He was through the '80s. He was always a babyface. Everybody loved him. They knew he represented Portland, Oregon. He was from here, legitimately from here. And when he went to the WWF, he wore Oregon on his tights. I mean, his colors were the same colors of the Oregon Ducks, yellow and green. I mean, he really was a local hero. I would bet. I was talking with, because in our newsroom, we had a lot of younger people that weren't here in the 80s, and we have a lot of people that, maybe moved here from other areas. And they don't, and I tried to explain to them, I was like, look, if you were here in the 1980s, I would say Billy Jack Haynes, probably top 5, definitely top 10 most beloved local figures, because this is early years of cable. Most people are just watching 3 or 4 channels. Portland wrestling was one of the top rated local shows. He's the hero. He's headlining the main events. When Ric Flair comes to town, that's who he's wrestling. How Flair would go around and wrestle the local hero. He's wrestling Billy Jack Haynes in this era. So he was a major figure in Portland, and very much presented as this hero, clean cut.
I grew up in the same area. I had the same experience. Billy Jack Haynes to me was like watching Hulk Hogan, but more in a local level. Yeah.
Yeah. And clean cut, kind of humble, soft spoken, all the things you want a hero to be. And I do know I have many friends that worked with him through the years. I don't know Billy Jack Haynes. I want to say that firsthand. I've only had a very brief hello, how are you, again, years ago. So I don't know him, but I know numerous people that work with him very closely. I know people outside of the wrestling business that knew him and had a lot of interactions with him. And it's kind of all over the place in terms of what he was like off camera. I know some people that say he was the nicest guy. He came and he spoke to their kids' school class and did all the traditional things and super nice. I know other wrestlers, for example, Len Denton, the grappler, whose autobiography I helped write, basically said Billy on one day could be the nicest guy in the world, and the next day, like, completely just, he would shut you out, not talk to you. Lenny says that he saw him slap a cameraman backstage. He said he saw him slap Percy Pringle before he became Paul Bearer backstage and break his glasses when he was in Florida. Roddy Piper did not care for him at all. Roddy he thought he was a bully. It's what Roddy told me personally. He said he's a bully. We worked on a local wrestling show in 2012, 2013, kind of a revamp of the Portland wrestling territory. And we brought in all the local legends that were still here. So we brought in Matt Bourne. We brought in Mean Mike Miller.
Matt Bourne eventually Doink.
Right. The one person we did not bring back was a bigger star than all of them, and that was Billy Jack Haynes. And the reason was because none of the people on that show that had experience with him, they didn't want to work.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, he was a big star. He was a major star. But by that point, they didn't want anything to do with him.
And it's hard to say what's going on because that's still several years ago. We don't know what's going on in his personal life.
We don't. I mean, by all accounts, by his own accounts, I mean, he's talked in interviews about his upbringing. I mean, he grew up, fighting on the streets. I mean, that's not. I mean, the one thing I'll tell you is that my friends Roddy, Lenny, they'll tell you, Billy Jack was a tough guy. He was a tough, strong, legit tough guy. You didn't mess with. You did not want to get on his bad side. This was a legit tough guy. Grew up on the streets, was a boxer, was a bodybuilder, got into pro wrestling. Was from here, so he grew up watching Portland wrestling, and he was a tough son of a gun. But he was also on the business side of things. There were several cases where he didn't burn bridges, but he did a lot to antagonize Don Owen, who's the longtime promoter here. He was Don's number one babyface.
He was the local Vince McMahon. Yep.
He was. But on multiple occasions, Billy and him clashed. And a lot of people like Roddy Piper, who were very loyal to Don Owen, did not appreciate it.
So Haynes has had a considerable, he's kind of been illustrious on YouTube over the years.
Yeah.
Just some wild stories, wild interviews. I don't think he liked Vince McMahon at all. And I don't want to go into the Vince McMahon world of things right now, but just he's been kind of illustrious online with a lot of the stories he's told there. And that's kind of how I think he's been known in his later years.
Yeah, and of course he was part of the lawsuit, of course, against WWE. Oh gosh, I don't know how many years ago now it was, but a class action suit regarding concussions and CTE and all of that. It got dismissed. The case got dismissed. It was a part of a class action suit, but he was kind of at the leading the charge on that. I mean, the WWE would say, well, he only wrestled for us for 2 years, and he wrestled everywhere else. Why is this just on us? But yeah, he brought up that lawsuit and did other things. I can't speak to all these claims that Billy made, but he certainly he didn't have a ton of. Well, I mean, like I say, he was the one local guy that was not brought back for the Portland wrestling revamp. I mean, I was not a part of that decision making process, but the people that were basically just said we don't want to deal with it.
Was it? I noticed I watched a lot of the Portland coverage on this. Was it? You were kind of expressing it. It was kind of a difficult dynamic because you have so many people who have no idea who this person is, but you have old time viewers who do know who he is and know him very well. Was that kind of a tough dynamic from a news perspective to juggle?
Well, no, it's interesting because I did spend, I think I told you yesterday, just explaining to my executive producer and some of these other folks, like, I don't think you guys understand like what a big deal this guy was 35. Yes, it has been 35 years. But what a massive deal he is. Because, yes, for the people that grew up here in the 80s where Portland wrestling was massive, I mean, this was, like I say, he was like the Von Erickson, Texas. We just saw the Iron Claw. We know how big those guys were in the Dallas area. Well, that's kind of what Billy Jack Haynes was in Portland. I mean, he in the 80s, he was the guy, the hero, the local guy that was representing all of us.
And I want to get back on the him going national real quick, which I never did. He fell off in WWF. I think he had his WrestleMania 3 match with Hercules. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I always thought, I just knew him as a viewer. I didn't know his personal drama. But based on how he was as just watching him, I thought they could have got a major push.
Oh, sure. He fit that mold. I mean, he could have been like an Intercontinental Champion. I mean, he had the look, the promo, just what they call, I mean, they don't really use this expression much, but a white meat baby face. I mean, just like, apple pie and mom. I mean, that was like the Billy Jack Haynes character, but with this kind of rugged Northwest gimmick. No, he absolutely had the potential to do that. Why it didn't happen? I mean, I'm sure he's put out his own theories about that in these interviews. I don't have no firsthand knowledge there, but certainly just from an outsider's perspective back then, he kind of fit the mold of a big WWE star.
Well, Joe Vithayathil, anchor and longtime journalist with KPTV in Portland, Oregon. Joe, thanks for joining us on the show today.
Yeah, I want to say I love talking about wrestling. I'm sorry that we have to do it because this is a tragic story that we are covering here, and I don't want us to lose track of the fact that there is a woman who lost her life. We still are getting the details on that, and ultimately, of course, that's what we're most concerned about is ensuring that we tell that part of the story correctly. So thanks for having me.
Sure. Joe V, thanks again. And so, that's Joe's kind of perspective as both covering this and a guy who's really kind of plugged in that community where he was located and a star for all those years. He grew up, same era that I did, watching him. He was our hero as a kid in that part of the country. So I want to talk about what's happened since his arrest. A lot of just legal back and forth. And we're going to have Belkis Plata, attorney based here in Florida, kind of come and help us break this down, what this means as far as moving forward with his murder case. So he's arrested after a couple days. He's booked in February. They go a lot of back and forth. They have his arraignment, appointing of counsel, discussing whether or not there should be a release, all the things that are pretty typical when someone's been arrested for murder. Then it kind of went on hold until April. They had some more hearings, and then he had 60 days to get his case to a trial. He waived that, which is pretty common, we're going to find out. For murder cases, they waive the speedy trial so attorneys can get all the things they need for both the prosecution and the defense. And then the most recent time they were in court was a hearing on custody issues, I guess it's called. This was in May 16th, so just in the last couple of weeks. And then there's nothing on the calendar now until November. So it looks like we're going to have a long gap after these few months of hearings till we get closer to a trial. So I wanted to bring in Belkis Plata. She's an attorney with the Plata Schott law firm based here in Florida to kind of help us break this down. Here's our interview with Belkis about what we can expect in the murder trial for Billy Jack Haynes. Well, we're joined on the show today by Belkis Plata with the Plata Schott law firm based in Florida. Belkis, thank you for joining us on the show today.
Absolutely.
I want to talk a little about what's going to happen in this case. It looks like there were a lot of pre-trial hearings that went up through earlier this month. And then from what I'm reading, there's kind of a delay for the next 7 months. Can you talk to me about what happens and why that may be in murder trials like this? This appears to be a second-degree murder case at this point.
Sure. So these types of cases are very complex. They're going to have a lot of evidence. A lot of people were on scene. There's going to be a lot of depositions to be had, a lot of things that defense counsel is going to have to sort through in order to be able to adequately prepare for a trial. And so it's not uncommon to see that these types of cases are postponed so that all parties can be ready in the event that there is a trial.
And in general, murder suspects in these cases remain kind of locked up until trial. Is that pretty typical?
More than likely, yes. I mean, every now and again, you might see someone who gets a release from custody, but it's more typical to see that they are reprimanded into custody and they have to stay there during the pendency of their case.
He is elderly. His wife is even more elderly than he was. Does age play a role in health with incarceration? I mean, he had to go in the hospital after the standoff. It looks like he's been locked up since. Does health play a role in determining if these things stretch out several months or, a year or whatever?
Sure. So, I mean, I think parties are going to take into account the age of the defendant. Sometimes the judges will take into consideration the impact on the jail system to be able to adequately house an individual who may have complex medical issues. And so sometimes they're going to balance that with releasing them maybe to be at home, to be on home confinement. Are they really a threat to the community in their current state? Obviously, he's charged with a homicide, so that's a very big deal. But the judges and the courts may sometimes weigh whether or not it makes more sense to house him, somewhere else because of his medical conditions. They want him alive and well to be able to make it through this proceeding.
As far as, what defense lawyers are doing, we don't know necessarily what happened in that home. We know he's elderly. We know his wife was even more elderly than he was. And by many accounts, had some extreme health issues that come with age. Do defense lawyers, are they kind of looking at that? Like what was going on in this home? What contributed to this? Is that a discussion defense lawyers are having?
Absolutely. So, I mean, it may be a conversation with the prosecution, depending on what comes out. From what I gather, I believe he's 80, she's 85, suffers from dementia, has a number of issues, and he has medical complications himself. And so it may be a conversation that they have as to the level of offense. So right now he's charged with second-degree murder. Other things considered, that could change. Could this go to trial? Possibly. Is it more likely that they will come to some type of resolution between the parties, the prosecution and the defense? Very plausible.
What do you mean by resolution? How does that work in a murder case?
So they may consider allowing him to plead to a lesser offense than what he's charged with. There may be mitigating circumstances that the defense will present, depending on the victim's family as well. All the circumstances surrounding, their lives and how this came to be. The state may consider resolving this for something much less than what he's currently charged with.
I don't know his mental state. I don't know. He was a public figure many years ago. He's been off the radar for quite a long time now. Will mental cognition be discussed and looked at in this case?
Absolutely. So I was reading something about him and some other wrestlers who had filed a case and it went to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court denied hearing it about issues that they suffered brain injuries during their time. And so it's possible that there may be some cognitive issues, and it's possible that the defense may explore that and may have him see a neurologist, maybe have him do a brain scan, see if there's something else going on that might have played a role into what happened.
I'm looking through the case file here out in Oregon, and I know I deal with a lot of cases in Florida, and a lot of those documents are readily available. It doesn't look to be the case here. We've kind of just seen, what's happened in this case, but I'm not seeing a lot of police reports published by the courts yet. Is that not totally uncommon, depending on where you're at?
Sure. So
we have a lot of answers.
Right. So jurisdictions are very different in the way that they release information, how you have to request the information. But the majority of these things are going to be public record. And so there just may be some hoops that you have to jump through to get them. But the community should have access to certain documents.
As far as one of the journalists I spoke to, talked to, they've talked to neighbors. That's about the majority of information they've been able to get from neighbors. Will police, will prosecutors in that jurisdiction, be talking to anyone who knew them, family, friends, neighbors, to get an idea of what was going on in this life?
Absolutely. So I believe, the police have probably done their canvass and talked to people, and they will provide the reports to the state, and then the state may send their own investigators out there. The defense may send investigators out there as well if there's helpful information to their client based on what neighbors may have seen or known about what was happening in that home. And so it's very possible that those neighbors will become witnesses in one way or the other.
And as far as it's a second-degree murder charge as opposed to a first-degree murder charge, first degree I assume would mean, this is a planned event. Is that kind of how the differentiation goes?
Yeah, so premeditation is what would make this a first-degree felony, first-degree murder, which would be that this was a premeditated act. The second-degree murder is just that there was an act that caused the death of this person. And so from all accounts right now, it doesn't appear that they have enough to prove or substantiate that this was premeditated, that this may have just been, something that happened on that particular day.
And this also was a chaotic scene that day. There was a standoff with police. It just, does that play a role in the trial for the murder, or will the prosecutors only really looking at the murder that day?
So, I think they're going to look at everything, but what goes before the jury will simply be that the homicide part. If he's charged with resisting violence, resisting officers without violence or with violence or what have you, if there are any charges that stem from the standoff, then sure, that could all come to be together. But the defense could also argue that would be prejudicial to the defendant if the jury hears all of it. So I think it's still too early to tell whether or not it will all be played out together. But I think the state has enough with just the homicide.
Well, Belkis Plata with the Plata Shot Law Firm, thanks for joining us on the show today.
Happy to be here.
So I want to thank Belkis for coming on, helping us kind of break down what we can expect. So we're probably going to not hear a lot on the Billy Jack Haynes unless something unexpected comes up until late this year. And then we will get an idea of a trial date. More documents will be out. We'll get an idea if maybe there's been some sort of deal made and this doesn't go to trial. Also very possible. There's a lot of mitigating circumstances in this case with age and health and what went on in that house in February. We don't have the answer yet. That will eventually come out. We'll get a better idea. And I want to thank Joe Vithayathil with KPTV in Portland for joining us today to help us break down this case. And thank you for joining us. Glad you could be with us. This was a bit of a serious episode. We're going to have a lot more fun in coming weeks with the River City Wrestling Con on the horizon and all the big stars coming on Going Ringside. So look forward to it all summer. Thank you for joining us today for another episode of Going Ringside. We'll see you next time.
This has been Going Ringside with the local station, brought to you every Wednesday on your favorite podcast player, on News4 Jax Plus, as well as the News4 Jax YouTube channel.